Let me just see if I can share my screen properly without.
While Rachel's sharing a screen, if I could introduce her to us. Rachel is the Associate Director of an organisation called CLEES, which is the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. And she's got an interesting history. I mean, I'm not quite sure, Rachel, perhaps you'd like to say what this is, but you used to work for PwC. That must be some big multinational consultancy of some kind. So you've turned gamekeeper to poacher from the sounds of it. So you might want to say a little bit more by way of introducing yourself about that switch from the corporate world to effectively a voluntary organisation that's working for more progressive policies in terms of economics, particularly at a local level. Rachel joined CLEES in 2020, and having previously, as I mentioned, worked for PwC. She also has got a master's degree in public administration at University College London. Their Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. A core part of the course was public, private and third sectors having to work collaboratively in multidisciplinary approaches to socio-economic and environmental problems. So that very much relates to the theme of tonight's presentation on firing up local economies and the Green New Deal. And so very much welcome you, Rachel, to ISW, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So yeah, good evening, and thank you for welcoming here. And as Paul says, I've been on quite a journey to get to you tonight. I spent many of my formative years in Northampton, just down the road. So I do know Wellingborough a bit. And actually from the vantage point of Northampton, I always thought of Wellingborough as being quite affluent. And you certainly have a better functioning train line. But in preparing for tonight, I'm kind of wondering where that image came from, and maybe looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts later. And so from Northampton, various events led to me living overseas for 15 years. And much of this was spent working, as Paul said, for PwC, the kind of professional services consulting giant. And I spent nearly 20 years with them working in various locations around the world. I was in Tokyo, New York, Honolulu, London, Cape Town, Lagos. But 2 years ago, I left to pursue a master's studying under Mariana Mazzucato, who's getting a lot of attention right now about her moonshot economics theories. And this was really brought about by a frustration of seeing the same problems in the same places, in many places, and knowing that there has to be a better way to build and create economies and societies that work for more people. And that's really what brought me here to you tonight. So I'm sure much more importantly, you want to, even though I could talk about my journey all night, you want to hear about what we do at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, which we actually call ourselves CLES. So just clarifying the pronunciation there.
Not CLEES.
Not CLEES.
No.
Not
John CLEES, but
no, CLES. Sorry.
Sorry.
No problem. So what do we do? We're a small organisation. We're actually only 14 people, but we're doing big things in local places around the UK. And we champion progressive economics that work for people, planet and place. And we're nominally a think tank, but really, as I explain to you later, you'll find us at our most happy when we're in the field, not just thinking, but doing, and working to help local places achieve social justice and deliver better public services. And today I'm going to speak briefly about us as an organisation, but why it's even more necessary right now in the current COVID crisis for our work. And I'm going to explain some concrete examples of our work and what we've done, discussing particularly the Preston model, which we're most well known for, but also how that intersects with the Green New Deal as being a way out of this crisis and building a fundamentally fairer and greener future. So at CLES, we advocate the embedding of what we call community wealth building principles into local economies. And this is reshaping the long-term goals away from GDP growth into more broader measures around well-being. It's about weaving social, economic and ecological justice into the economy so that it becomes part of the system rather than an outcome of the system. It redirects local wealth back into local economies and places and gives more control to local people and local businesses. And I'm sure you'll agree, unless I've completely misjudged the crowd, that the mainstream approach to economic development was failing. It's really missed the mark. We have increasing levels of inequality and damage to the environment. And COVID-19 has really laid bare.
Rachel, did I just introduce, your sound keeps fading in and out for some reason.
Let me try and rejig myself. Is that better? No?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, so it's because I think I'm looking over here. If I sit like this, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. All right, so before the current crisis, the evidence of this failure was all around in terms of record numbers of people living in poverty, on 0 hours contracts, and the refreshed Marmot review showed that life expectancy was stalling for the first time in a century in some areas. We have record numbers of people experiencing homelessness, but one of our most buoyant sectors is construction and real estate. You know, these things just don't make sense. And at CLES, we've advocated for many years that it's imperative to build an economy that serves our collective needs and shares wealth with as many people as possible, because this creates a more stable social foundation. And as we've seen in COVID, if you have a society which is where people and places are already vulnerable or ill-equipped to meet everyday challenges, they're going to be knocked completely sideways by a global pandemic. And you don't need me to tell you that COVID-19 isn't just a health crisis, it's a social and economic disaster. And the Chancellor's warning us that we're going to face a recession, the likes of which we have not seen. And this is going to place an even greater burden, as it already is, upon our public services. And despite hearing that we're all in it together, the evidence and the statistics show that isn't the case. Poverty is a significant factor in the incidence of COVID, and the economic impact is falling upon the working poor, the young, and also those in working class jobs who cannot easily work from home or who live in cramped conditions and cannot afford to isolate. So the way that we see it at CLES is the pandemic has really revealed those existing fractures. We knew they were there already. It's clear that we're nowhere near the end of the crisis though. And it's only going to get worse, being compounded by the effects of Brexit, this entrenched inequality, but also the climate emergency, which is looming or already hitting, depending on your perspective. And there's no doubt that the status quo, we won't go back to where we were. Something is going to change. And we see three scenarios. There's the bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the bad, we would say, is a return to austerity, as we saw in 2008. That we obviously don't want that. It takes the bottom out of the economy and hits the poorest hardest. The ugly takes that austerity measure on steroids and couples it with bypassing local and regional democracies and their ability to adapt to how the pandemic has affected them. But then there is a good. There is a chance for reform. We've all heard the terms Build Back Better, Green Recovery, the Green New Deal, and we would agree that there is a broad understanding that the present crisis is our best opportunity to change course and build a more generative, social, sustainable and democratic local economic system that creates a fairer society and allows us to tackle the climate crisis. But there is no guarantee that this is going to come to fruition, and certainly limited agreement, we would say, on what kind of form that would take. So let's return to the focus of today. What can happen and what is actually happening at the local level to fire up local economies to bring about this fairer, greener and more inclusive future? We argue for a complete rethink of economic development and who actually plays a role in the economic development. We need to build an inclusive economy, one that actually places well-being above growth. And our focus on GDP as a measure has distracted us from the fact that median income has been falling, which means that we have a problem with the way that wealth is being distributed across society and across the country. In Wellingborough, you know this as well as anyone. You sit in a nominally rich part of the country. But you know that Wellingborough, like many towns, has been reliant on inward investment to create jobs and wealth. and it makes it vulnerable to economic downturns that are beyond your control. There's a need to build a more fundamental local resilience. And we also need to think about what we're measuring, as this shapes the conversation and goals. We keep hearing we're the 5th largest economy in the world, but that isn't the measure that really shows what people's lives, daily lives, are really like. So when we talk about local economic development, we're talking about the whole economy, not just growth sectors. We want to focus on the real economy rather than those financialized aspects, because they really mask how wealth is distributed. The way we see it as an inclusive economy is one that focuses on social goals, social justice, environmental sustainability, and a shared prosperity. This is a more holistic measure of well-being. And this contrasts with inclusive growth. I don't know if you can see that in the slides, but inclusive growth aims to improve living standards, yes, and share benefits of increased prosperity more evenly across social groups. But the inclusive growth perspective is really talking about what happens to growth after we've grown it. So this is helpful, but it's limited, right? And it's limiting, given the scale of the crisis that we have. It's also oxymoronic. It talks about it's exclusive, not inclusive. What about areas which aren't growing? What about sectors which aren't high growth sectors? What about the left behind areas? How long do they have to wait for wealth to trickle down or to trickle in? And whilst I know there is debate about growth and degrowth, it is clear that our planet's resources are not infinite, they are finite. And any conversation has to include that we can't just continue down this path of consumption and extraction. So to illustrate, this isn't just semantics. When we talk about an inclusive economy, we mean these collective goals, social justice and prosperity. It considers value and well-being in a broad sense, but also in the local context. It seeks to make sure that that local generated wealth stays local and fosters local resilience. And we at Claire's, we've always believed, but also demonstrated that the public sector has a distinct and important role to play in building this local economy. And the current crisis has shown us that that's an absolute imperative. So it was out of these frustrations that we developed community wealth building as a concept. And it's one that really looks at how local places can develop in a way that puts people, place and planet at the centre. It's a newer economic model that is in response to these failures that I talked about.
Rachel, you're beginning to fade in and out again. Sorry.
I don't know what's happening. See if I can turn around like that. Okay.
Try, yeah, that sounds better. Try.
Okay. Right. So it isn't just often, when we speak to certain places, they think it's about bringing in a large external employer to create jobs. And whilst this may work, all too often that approach doesn't create wealth that stays local for ordinary people in ordinary communities. And it certainly doesn't necessarily develop the supply chain. And with businesses that are headquartered outside of an area, all too often those profits go out of the local area and the benefits don't translate long term. So community wealth building is about trying to make that local wealth stick and rebuilding that connection between the people and the places that actually create the wealth and who can benefit. And that's what's at the heart of community wealth building. And so, sorry, this slide isn't very clear, but basically it's talking about terminology, because terminology is important because it affects what we're measuring. So if we're talking about, productivity as the measure, shouldn't we be talking about good employment, the quality of the jobs? Instead of looking at kind of hard infrastructure, what's the social infrastructure? Because that's probably what's really going to impact people's lives. And so once again, getting away from this idea of an increase in GDP as the kind of key measure, because that really doesn't tell us about what's going on day to day. So who is it who really leads this change? Who is it really who can create the community wealth? So for us, it's these anchor institutions. They play a real defining role in creating and reinforcing local economic ties. And when we talk about anchor institutions, we're referring to organisations that have an important presence in a place, usually by being virtue of large-scale employers, largest purchasers of goods and services, but also overseeing large areas of land and having relatively fixed assets. They're often tied to a place by their mission, by their history, by their physical assets and local relationships. So examples can include local authorities, NHS trusts, colleges, housing associations, prisons, and also the combined activities of the community and voluntary sector. We typically wouldn't think of a private business as an anchor institutions, but ones that have been embedded in a place for so long could be considered. But the risk of placing emphasis on a private employer can be painful if once they leave, there's so much loss, and you just can't rely on that one silver bullet. And this is why we think that our current recovery has to be public sector led. And the traditional view is that anchor institutions are in place to provide public services, which obviously they are, but this has overlooked the significant influence that they can have on a local economy, to say as an owner, as a buyer, and as an employer. They have tremendous power to strengthen the economy from the inside out. They are local wealth creators in terms of jobs, spend, and value. But the likelihood is that they have not been seen this way by anyone else, but they also haven't seen or thought of themselves as that way either. And that's a real shift in perspective in terms of impact, because these anchor activities can have such impacts on the social determinants of health, income, wealth, economic equality, job stability, sense of agency, access to affordable safe housing. They can also collaborate better. This is often built into their mission as public sector institutions and their purpose, but they often need support and kind of coming together to bring this into fruition. And I think there's also a point that their kind of confidence has been eroded in many cases by being beaten down and seeing as you're a drain on the public purse rather than seeing what value they can really add. But we would say that they can shape the market towards greener technologies and processes and use that real might of the public pound. So how do we do this? We do it through the 5 pillars of community wealth building. So these are the platform on which you can grow a greater local and community ownership of the economy. So the first pillar is around the progressive procurement of goods and services. This asks us to think about what anchors are actually buying and who do they buy from and what kind of institutions are they buying from, and are they doing this in a way that benefits local businesses and communities. The second pillar is around the socially productive use of land. This looks at who owns what and how is it used, and tries to ensure that financial and social gain is harnessed locally and not by faraway landlords. Thirdly, we think about fair employment and just labour markets. Who is employed, but also how are they employed? Is it secure or is it precarious? What are they being paid? The fourth pillar is finance, which seeks to increase the flows of investment with local economies rather than relying on attracting capital in. And the last pillar is pluralising the economy, thinking about who owns what in Wellingborough and in Northamptonshire. Sorry, my cat has now just invaded. So as I've explained, our anchor institutions have great purchasing power, and there's growing awareness that this should be used to shape and steer economies towards fairer social, economic and environmental outcomes. So what are they purchasing and who are they purchasing from? What is the role of social value and how is this being pushed and stretched? We often think about large contracts when we think of public sector spend, but what about those smaller contracts, those ones that don't have such rigorous kind of tendering processes? Can they be opened up to more local generative businesses? So for example, there's ones kind of that are sub 25,000 or maybe sub 10,000. And what we've seen in our work in the south of Scotland, in Lewis and in Greenwich, is we're seeing conscious efforts to really use that public pound to develop green technology, working on retrofit, trying to match youth unemployment to the jobs of the future around sustainability and more energy efficient homes. In Wales and North Ayrshire, we're seeing this around local food. So working with local suppliers to really limit those food miles and stimulate local farms to supply schools and colleges and other places where they need to supply food to whoever's going to be there. And in Glasgow, we're seeing how construction contracts can really animate local economies, developing supply chains and employment from priority groups in terms of some of the work that's going on there in the infrastructure developments around the city deals. When we talk about socially productive use of land, this is to say it's about how it's actually owned and how it's used. So it tries to tackle this idea that we have that's so entrenched in the UK around the idea of land as a commodity first and foremost. And it shifts the perspective to thinking about land's social and ecological purpose. So making spaces available for local people and businesses. As I say, we're in the UK, we're obsessed with the idea of land and property as a source of wealth creation. But we're trying to say, how can more people have an equal piece of the pie? Who owns what? Not just who owns it and who uses it, but how are we stewarding it? And really trying to hardwire those kind of ideas of social justice into planning frameworks and making sure that affordable housing isn't just an add-on to a development, that maybe it's the real raison d'etre of something that's happening. Around fair employment and just labour. So thinking about what's driving the local market, the local labour market. Are there smaller opportunities for local employment that connect people to jobs that really connect them to a place? And this requires us to think about, for example, right now, about how COVID has impacted a population and what can be done to proactively address this. So, for example, if you in an area has seen a real decline in travel or hospitality or manufacturing, and think about how that local labour market could be used to fill the gaps where there are places, for example, in terms around healthcare, social care, PPE development, those kind of things. So trying to make those matches happen. And working also with local colleges and universities to develop routes into employment that really fit with local growth plans, perhaps around green tech and retrofit. And once again, this is something we're seeing particularly in the south of Scotland, where they're really trying to develop energy efficient homes, but they just do not have the people in place to install those kind of technologies and maintain them and service them. So trying to kind of match those routes. And then financial power. Now this is my bag. I spent years working on some crazy stuff with PwC, but finance is the glue, and we have to see it as something that doesn't just belong in the city of London or in the hands of millionaires and billionaires. It really does help oil the process. So trying to see how we can get and use a kind of more sustainable local economic ecosystem. So looking at community, regional and ethical banking. There's certainly plans afoot across the UK to set up more regional banks. Using pension funds for local investment. I'll talk a bit about that later, but these are massive amounts of money that are being invested in places like Brazil, and offshore, and that's seen as being kind of, getting your high returns for high risk. Why aren't we investing that more locally, where it really can make a difference to the people who are going to benefit long term from those pensions? Looking at credit unions, what is their role? Can they lend kind of micro lending to certain people and certain businesses in specific sectors and places? And also looking at alternative currencies. We've all reevaluated, I think, our sense of local. There's a real gap there in looking to how we can kind of really draw on that and build on that in a way that's more sustainable in terms of better local financial flows. And then finally, we talk about plural and democratic ownership of the economy. So we've got like what we would say is a spectrum of extractive and generative businesses. I'm sorry. So seeing that as being there shouldn't be two doors. There shouldn't be a door for social businesses and a door for commercial businesses. We need to have one big door that allows our kind of more generative businesses to have access to contracts and opportunities to grow. But also we need to speak to our extractive commercial businesses and say, hey, you need to be behaving more ethically. Trying to bring those two together and not seeing them as segregated. Yeah, so looking at different types of ownership models, cooperative businesses, local businesses and family businesses, as these tend to be more grounded in a place. We're living in an era of rethinking not just socioeconomic inequality, but also racial and gender inequalities. We have to look at who owns what and how more inclusive economies can be supported and woven into the local economic system. So for example, female entrepreneurs, minority-owned businesses, or those who employ certain priority groups, and seeing how they can be embedded into the ecosystem through the use of public spending. So where does the green agenda fit in? You may disagree, but I think in the UK there is a broad consensus that we are facing a real climate emergency and there has to be action. I think the debate is around the scale of the challenge, the speed of actions, and the trade-offs that need to happen. We hear that we need to think global and act local, and on the green agenda we would agree wholeheartedly. And we've debated whether whether the green agenda needs to be a separate pillar, but we think actually it needs to be woven and thread through each pillar. We see the Green New Deal and community wealth building as natural bedfellows that require practical innovations on planning, capital investments, energy, housing and transport. We need a green local industrial strategy. There is an opportunity right now and a greater appetite to reform these key sectors of the economy, and localities must be allowed to develop the green industrial strategy that harnesses all resources to create, to invest in those less than carbon intensive sectors and ensure a just transition. And looking to green jobs that can really revitalise rural and ex-industrial local economies. There must be a focus on the foundational economy, the economy that really matters, and a provision of shovel-ready green jobs, underpinned by a local guarantee. And finally, we must use our anchor spend that we talked about to flex those existing practices towards social, economic and environmental justice. This can't be a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach. It has to be tailored. And we would argue that it can only succeed if you're looking at grassroots change rather than top-down. So where have we worked? You can see from the map that we found it easier to work in certain places, and certainly we haven't done as much in the southeast. But I actually think, and it'd be interesting to hear what you think, that that's where we think most of our work is needed right now. We found a lot of support for our work in Scotland, in Wales, and in the northeast, and in certain pockets in London. But it really does require a new way of thinking and doing. And we're finding that we're getting a lot of calls from places that we wouldn't expect to hear from as a result of the current problems. So, time to talk about Preston. So this is our most famous work, and certainly we're known for our Preston model. So this started back in 2011 and has received international media attention. It's really influencing policy, not just in the UK, but also overseas in Europe and in North America as well. So you'll know that Preston was a huge part of the Industrial Revolution, but it really struggled to adapt post-industrialisation. And what Preston was doing was it was relying on inward investment from big businesses. It was looking at shopping centres and factories as being kind of the source, the silver bullet for their economic woes. But the wealth that was being created wasn't staying, it wasn't sticking, and it kept going out. So in 2011, the council worked with us to try and do things differently. And trying to say, how could they build wealth from within rather than looking to attract something from outside? So what they did was they brought together the big anchor institutions, those ones which are rooted in place, that were always going to be in Preston. They weren't going to up and leave when the going got tough. So that was Preston City Council, the Lancashire County Council, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Lancashire, the Housing Association locally, Community Gateway, Preston College, Cardinal Newman College, and the University of Central Lancashire. And what they did was they worked together collaboratively to see how their spend could be more generative locally. And that generated more than 70 million for the city economy and 200 million for the regional economy. It created 1,600 more jobs, and they weren't just any jobs. So now there's 4,000 more people being paid the real living wage. Food co-ops and tech co-ops were set up, supported by anchors, supporting local social innovation. And they used pension funds to invest in the local area. once again, using that real massive pot of money to try and say, what can it do here? And I have to say, because things often come around, but in 2018, it was announced by my old firm, PwC, that Preston was the most improved place to live in the UK. Now, one of the things that we get frustrated about at CLES is that we're only known for the Preston model. And in fact, we've been doing good work in other places. So I'm just going to briefly talk about four other examples that I hope you'll find useful. So firstly, Scotland. We found that we have real buy-in in Scotland. So it started with a small Labour council in North Ayrshire, who was really progressive and really wanted to do some impressive stuff. And they did a community wealth building pilot that started last year that really focused on democratising the economy. So looking, to save their kind of high street and by converting businesses into ones that were more generative. And they pioneered the Ayrshire Growth Deal. Now, Ayrshire as well, it has some challenges in terms of kind of, failing, if you like, sorry, that's not the right word, but towns, but also some real big kind of land, rural land that needs to be owned in a more generative fashion. So they're really kind of starting to spread the tentacles in these different places, even within one local authority. And what happened following on the back of that is that Scotland has now become the first national government to adopt a wholesale community wealth building approach. And it's seen as being central to the government's aspirations to deliver a wellbeing economy. And it now features in the Scottish Programme for Government. And it's also been seen as part of the real kind of COVID recovery. So we're working on 5 ongoing projects. So in the Glasgow City region, the Western Isles, Fife, Clackmannanshire and the south of Scotland. And what we've done is in certain places, we've looked across all 5 pillars. But for example, in the south of Scotland, we're just looking very specifically at housing associations and who they buy and procure from. So it can go narrow, it can go deep. But the fact is, as I say, I think the fact that we've got the political backing really helps kind of harness everybody around the same kind of goal. In Wales, we found a similar positive partner, and we're looking to advance community wealth building specifically around procurement. So looking not only at kind of post-industrial areas, but also rural communities. And looking to specifically around, say, how that pound is being spent in a post-COVID recovery. So, for example, looking at food, but also looking at vulnerable economic sectors and businesses within the Welsh economy and seeing how they maybe can be supported and stimulated through that public spending. And also, I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Wales, they have a pioneering Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which says that you must balance the considerations of the future generations as well as the current generations. And Lord Bird, the founder of The Big Issue, is trying to do something similar across the UK. And I think you would argue that kind of long-term thinking is something that we really need and is lacking right now. You probably know that we're based in Manchester. So there we've been working very closely with the mayor and other stakeholders to drive and develop the concepts of social value. Social value is often thought to link purely to procurement spending, but really trying to see that in the concept of kind of land use, in say fair employment practices, and embed it beyond the public sector so that it becomes a real way of doing business in Greater Manchester. But there is an issue in Greater Manchester that was revealed this week around climate action. It was revealed that their pension, their public pension fund, has one of the largest amounts still invested in fossil fuels across the UK, and that's 4.6%. And I think this reveals a real tension. Can a region like GM, which has made really bold commitments to kind of carbon neutrality, can it really be committed to carbon neutrality when it's still investing and benefiting from these polluting firms? And going back to that point, I didn't think I made it earlier, but we can't just outsource our carbon usage. So really thinking globally as part of this Green New Deal. So is that hypocrisy or is it pragmatism? I'd be keen to hear your thoughts. And then lastly, I want to talk to you about Birmingham. And I guess that's kind of closest in geography to where you are. So we've been doing some really interesting stuff there. So my colleague, the guy in green on the slide, he's our first community wealth builder in residence. And for the past year, he's been working with 7 of the largest anchor institutions in Birmingham that have a combined workforce of over 50,000 people and a budget of 5 billion. And he's been looking specifically at how they can recover from COVID with a focus on employment and procurement. So what they've done is look at their individual organisational plans across the anchors and seeing how they can support recruitment from neighbourhoods that are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. They've also tried to develop more inclusive employment practices, so looking at people who are underrepresented in the economy and from the most deprived areas, and then increase secure and living wage employment in these most deprived areas again, through real targeted recruitment for anchors. On procurement, they have explored how individual anchors, so immediate need for goods and services, how can these proactively be promoted to local suppliers affected by COVID-19? So they've supported the sharing of good practice and identified opportunities for market shaping. So using joint action to stimulate more socially responsible suppliers in key sectors and strengthen links between procurement teams, commissioners and economic development organisations. And so once again, looking at those most deprived areas of the city. So before I close and before my cat goes completely insane, which I'm not sure if you can hear, but I wanted to kind of talk to you about some of the tensions that we're facing and grappling with in our work. So the first is, how do we balance the purity of our message with a desire to build a fairer society for all? And these ideas that Claire's has been talking about for years are taking root, but that's naturally bringing a dilution. You know, how pure do we want to be? How important is the context? Who should we work with? Who can we work with? How do we measure things? If we just go back to talking about growth, the number of jobs created, asset prices, aren't we just going to go back to the same old ways? We need to think about what we're actually asking people to measure, because that will steer the direction. And do we want to rebalance, or do we want to reset? How do we get that balance between aspiration and practicality? And how do we make those trade-offs between sustainability and the just transition? So in conclusion, I hope this has provided you with some insight into our work, not just in Preston, but elsewhere. And as I say, at Claire's, we are not just advocating a greener, social, more generative recovery, but we're also trying to make that a reality through our work at the coalface. Thank you. I'm really sorry about the howling.
I thought that was Derek actually, but he's muted.
So embarrassing. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right.
You should let her out. So was she trapped in the room?
No, well, I was saying that to Paul earlier. It's the minute I get on a Zoom, he just starts howling. And if he sees a closed door, he just stands it and howls. So
Oh my God.
We'll let him in. We'll come and we'll say hello to him.
he'll be here in a minute.
Okay. Good.
He's coming in now.
Okay, folks. Well, Rachel, thank you very much for that introduction to what is a huge topic, spanning local economies, national economies, indeed international, and of course some of the ideas have been around for quite a long while. Cooperatives, the idea of cooperatives, communities working together, but in a sense, the crisis is now, as a result of COVID, as a result of all the years of austerity that we've had, is now acute. I mean, local economies are now collapsing, I would say, certainly town centres. I'm not sure, you know, you walk around Wellingborough town centre, Northampton, they're collapsing now. So there's some serious problems here. But